Follows Joe Coburn now with Daily Politics.
Hello and welcome to the Daily Politics. Boris Johnson hails a turning point in the fight to combat Vladimir Putin's ambitions following the biggest ever mass expulsion of Russian spies from Western countries. Russia vows to hit back following the expulsion of its agents from over 20 countries. So what might that response look like? We'll get the thoughts of a leading former ambassador. Two top Tory heavyweights, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Chris Patten, are battling it out over our future relationship with the EU, and we'll speak to both men live. Pressure is mounting on Jeremy Corbyn following yesterday's anti-Semitism protests. We speak to author and comedian David Baddiel, who tells us where he thinks the Labour leader is going wrong.
Anti-Semitism is kind of invisible to people like Jeremy Corbyn to some extent because they are more interested in this idea of fighting the good fight against capitalism.
Cool Conservatives? It worked for this lot, as the Young Conservatives reform will ask a leading member how can they tempt millennials. All that in the next hour, and with us for the whole of the programme today is a man who is never knowingly undersold, the former managing director of John Lewis. I'm sure he's heard that one before, and now the Conservative Mayor of the West Midlands, Andy Street. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
Australia has become the latest country to expel Russian diplomats as part of a global response to the poisoning of a Russian spy in the UK. The Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull said the brazen attack in Salisbury was an attack on all of us. More than 100 Russian diplomats from more than 20 countries were expelled in a coordinated response by the US and EU nations yesterday. Boris Johnson has been speaking in the Commons in the last half hour.
One of the conclusions that we can draw from the 23 countries who chose to expel diplomats or people whose presence was not conducive to the public good, as they say, is the importance they attach to cooperation with our security services. And he can be in no doubt that that cooperation will intensify in the months and years ahead.
Boris Johnson there. Well, how is Russia likely to respond? Joining us now in the studio to discuss that is Adam Thompson, former UK ambassador to NATO and now director of the European Leadership Network. Welcome to the programme. Did you expect such a forthright response from the EU, from NATO and from the US?
To be honest, I didn't. And I think it's to the credit of British diplomacy that the response has been as strong and as widespread as it already has. The international community could choose to have seen this just as an unfortunate one-off that concerned the UK but somehow didn't affect the rest of the world. And Britain has been able to provide enough evidence, enough argument to make the point that this is about the international order, about an arms control treaty that has been violated.
Do you think it's also about these countries finally waking up to the threat of Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, I think it's some of that. I mean, it has been a pretty relentless drumbeat of challenge, at least as the West has chosen to see it, for some time now. And since the Crimea annexation in 2014 is when I suppose the clock really started ticking on this for the West. At the same time, I think you need to recognise this is only 24 countries out of some 200 around the world, and they are Britain's friends. So there's a bigger challenge for British diplomacy in the longer term about really persuading the international community to make the Chemical Weapons Convention, which is what has been violated, according to Britain, actually work.
Will it really make a difference, though? I mean, as you've just said, it's a number of countries, an impressive number, but there are many more that haven't responded in this way. And actually, Russia has been operating outside diplomatic circles and the diplomatic rules for quite a long time now. So will they take any notice?
Well, I think, to be fair to the Russians, they'd say they've been operating within, probably, and that the British government's response is undiplomatic. The extent to which Russia has really been stung by this we will see in the scale of their response. My impression of the Russian response to Britain's initial steps was that they did not want to escalate this. I mean, Russia is a country, when pushed, has to respond and kick back, and so there will be a Russian response to this. But their choice of response to the UK was purely the expulsion of diplomats and the closure of a consulate. It didn't run down the list of other measures that Theresa May announced.
How do you think? I mean, do you get any sense of how the Kremlin will respond now?
Not much. Talking to my Russian members, it's a pan-European organisation, the impression had been that after his election, which was a foregone conclusion,
of course, yes.
Re-election, President Putin actually would like to change the dynamic with the West, that he might be interested in less political isolation and a better working relationship. That, I think, has receded into the future unless he does something remarkable. And in the immediate term, he has to play to his domestic base and look tough.
Andy, in terms of any dialogue, in terms of any engagement with Russia, do you still think that should be quite an important component in how we deal with Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think first thing we should say is that the action that's been taken by the Prime Minister and indeed the Foreign Secretary and the Foreign Office has been incredibly successful. And we should reflect the fact that this is a really strong endorsement of the line which says global Britain, and indeed says that we might be leaving the EU, but we're still a critical part of the EU security structure. And this is a real evidence point for everything the Prime Minister has said. But I think Adam had it absolutely right in terms of engagement with Russia. The Russians have propagated the line that they are acting just within international acceptable standards. And I think we've led the world in saying, no, that is not right. You have actually stepped far too far, and we needed to be firm and be really, really clear about that.
And other countries will follow Britain, it seems, in terms of withholding or withdrawing ministers going to the World Cup.
Yeah, I think there'll be a lot of drama and back and forth. The point I'd like to make, though, is that quite apart from the unfortunate Skripals, this is a case where, for the first time since the Second World War, as far as we know, nerve agent has been used. And if the British government is right, it's been done by a state in violation of a really important international treaty, the Chemical Weapons Convention. So if Britain is going to carry the international community, it's got to keep going on this. It's got to convince the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons that they have a case. It's got to take that to the OPCW and allow for perhaps challenge inspections of Russian chemical facilities. This is going to run for a long time, and sustaining that when it drops out of the media and in the face of Russia's ability to throw up lots of dust is going to be a real challenge.
Adam Thompson, thank you very much. Employers in the UK are fearful about the kind of immigration system that ministers could introduce after Brexit. That's according to the government's official advisor on these matters, the Migration Advisory Committee. The Home Secretary Amber Rudd asked the committee to look at EU migration last summer, in the light of the Brexit negotiations, of course, and their interim report is out today. Well, the chairman of the Migration Advisory Committee is Professor Alan Manning, and he joins me now. Welcome to the programme. Why do you say in your report that businesses are fearful about the kind of post-Brexit immigration system the government could introduce?
I mean, part of it is simply the uncertainty about not knowing what the future system will be. But there are also other concerns. I mean, for higher skill employers, they're worried about European workers being brought under the current non-EU system, which they generally don't have a high opinion of. And for lower skill employers, The current non-EU system simply doesn't allow them to bring in any workers at all, so they're worried about what the future holds for them.
Right, and what's your evidence for saying in the report that EU workers are higher quality and more eager than British workers?
I think we don't say exactly that. So, I mean, what we show in the report is that there's quite an important difference between EU workers from the older member states, the countries that were members before 2004, who tend to be higher skilled and better paid than the average Briton. But those workers from the new member states, the countries that joined after 2004, tend to be lower skilled jobs and are paid on average less than the average Briton.
So if the government goes ahead with cutting immigration significantly, let's say it gets a bit closer, which it hasn't done obviously over the last few years, getting down to that net migration target of 100,000 or just below, which is less than half of what it is now, would that result, in your opinion, in better jobs and higher wages for people who are already in Britain?
We haven't come to a firm conclusion on that yet. This is an interim report and our view on that will be in our final report in September. But we don't think that the evidence points to any large effect on European migration on the labour market opportunities of Britons. And the evidence for that is that unemployment is at a 40-year low. Although we've had a very bad decade for people's living standards, it seems to be connected much more to the financial crisis. And actually lower skilled Britons haven't done worse than higher skilled Britons, which is what you might expect to see if European migration had had a bad effect on labour market opportunities for them.
Alan Manning, stay with us. Let me just get your response, Andy Street, to what you've heard. If I use this sentence from the report, it seemed plausible to us that EEA migrants from the European Economic Area are sometimes a higher quality, eager workforce compared to UK-born 9 workers, they say, in similar occupations. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't. I think what I see across the West Midlands, for example, is that we have incredible capability amongst our domestic workers, but they have not been sufficient in either number or actually the qualifications they've got to keep up with some of the really high growth industries. If you look at engineering and manufacturing, and we've needed to bring people in. Now, I see the opportunity at the end of Brexit for our own domestic immigration policy as an opportunity to make sure that we do still continue to draw people in where they are needed by our businesses. But it is absolutely no substitute for our own people getting the right skills to be successful going forward. It's got to be both.
Do you understand and sympathise with businesses who are fearful in the way that Alan Manning described, that they worry about an immigration system that might be similar to the one currently for non-EU workers, which they obviously don't think is very successful?
Yes, I do. I hear businesses all the time across the West Midlands saying to me, where are we going to find sufficient of the right quality people in the future? But I see this as an opportunity for us to actually get that right. So the report is welcome. The report's right to call out the concern. It's there. I hear it every day. But we have got to design the system to meet that going forward.
All right, let's talk about the overall impact, Alan, on the economy. I mean, would tax revenues and economic growth fall significantly if the government slashes migration to under 100,000?
Well, that would depend a lot on the way in which net migration was cut. So it's really impossible to answer that without more detail. I mean, again, the fiscal impacts on the public finances of European migration is something, again, we'll be considering in our final report. So I'm afraid we haven't come to any conclusion on that at the moment.
Right, OK. I mean, when you say you'd need to know how it's being cut, I mean, the target has been that net migration would fall to less than 100,000. Does that worry you in terms of an impact on the economy or not?
I mean, it depends a lot. There's a huge difference in the amount of tax paid, depending, for example, on how much you earn. There's a huge difference in the amount of public services that you consume, depending on your age and household circumstances. And so a lot depends not just on the total numbers, but on who those individuals are and what they're doing.
Right. I mean, do you support that arbitrary figure, which is what many people have said, of going under 100,000? When we spoke last time about this, you said perhaps 150,000 would be better. Do you still feel that?
So let's be clear. Your word arbitrary is absolutely right. And I think in terms of guiding that we expect the number to be lower That's right. But I said, hang on, there is really something really important about making sure our growth sectors have the mix of domestic and international calibre people. I mean, it's worked for other countries around the world, and I think the number will be a little more. But that's got to be worked through by the new policy.
Right. And finally, Alan, you've just said earlier in the interview, it's your interim report. The final version is due out in September. Isn't that going to be a bit late? If you think about the clock ticking that Michel Barnier always likes to talk about, Brexit deal being done in October, there'll only be a month to read your final report for government ministers and then design this immigration system post-Brexit.
Well, our report, our final report, is designed to provide an evidence base for the immigration system that the UK has after the end of the implementation period. So this is 2021. So this is still some way away. But
yeah, but there'll have to be a deal done in October that would surely have to have the nuts and bolts of an immigration system, even post the implementation period.
I don't know about that. I mean, it depends upon whether the UK becomes like many other countries, Canada and so on, which just decides its immigration policy on its own, or whether it's part of the negotiation. And that's not something I have any knowledge of, really.
All right, Alan, thank you very much for joining us. Now, Labour MPs are calling on Jeremy Corbyn to do more to root out anti-Semitism in the party. Last night, there were angry exchanges at the party's weekly meet-up of its MPs in Westminster. While outside, around 1,000 people met on Parliament Square in a rally organised by the Board of Deputies of British Jews and the Jewish Leadership Council to protest at what they see as Jeremy Corbyn's failure to root out anti-Semitism in the party. Our Ellie Price went along.
Well, I reckon there are probably several hundred people here at the rally on Parliament Square. We understand that the letter from the Board of Deputies and the JLC has been delivered to Jeremy Corbyn in Parliament. He's already issued a counter-statement in which he said that he will always be an ally against anti-Semitism. But the message from this protest is enough is enough.
I'm not voting Labour again under Jeremy Corbyn. I think he's absolutely horrendous leader of the Labour Party.
Is there anything that he could say or do now?
Nothing.
He can root out all the pockets of anti-Semitism, which he referred to, and it's more than pockets, and actually stand up and no longer be associated with the people who are clearly anti-Semites and anti-Israel.
Oh, Jeremy's racist. Oh, Jeremy's racist.
You're protesting against your leader?
I'm protesting against anti-Semitism. I'm protesting against anybody who puts up Facebook sites supporting murals which are disgusting. And I'm just saying that I want to stand with people here.
Well, while the rally is going on in Parliament Square here, there is now a counter-rally going on, though far fewer, of people in support of Jeremy Corbyn. Right, can I ask you, sorry to interrupt your argument, but why are you arguing?
Corbyn is blatantly anti-Semitic and racist, and these people have still supported him. It is ridiculous to smear him with anti-Semitism or racism. It's absurd.
This is not about Jeremy Corbyn and about his anti-Semitism. This is about trying to stop discussion about Israel.
Ellie Price reporting there on that protest. Well, a little earlier I spoke to the author and comedian David Baddiel, who is Jewish and is a long-time Labour supporter. I began by asking him if he thought there was a problem with anti-Semitism on the left.
Jews are the only ones who apparently have a high status, bad thing as well, which is they're in control and secretly pulling the strings behind global capitalism and own all the money and all the rest of it. So that idea, which is a racist myth, propagated first of all in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, but goes on before that, is something that activates the left. And so what happens is the mix-up, the idea that Jews are actually powerful and actually moneyed and privileged or whatever, means that they are not the oppressed. And because the job of the left is always to fight on behalf of the oppressed, Jews don't quite fit into that.
Right, but as a Jewish Labour supporter, what do you make of the way this has been dealt with by Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, having done that great big historical framework that I was trying to do, I think the key element for Jeremy Corbyn and for people around him is not that they are anti-Semitic, but they find anti-Semitism a bit invisible. Because more important to them is this attack on what they see as the forces of oppression. So if you take the Mere One mural, for example, Jeremy Corbyn, in being supportive of that mural, which he was on the Facebook site, I don't think that's because he's anti-Semitic. It's because his primary instinct is always, we must fight the forces of oppression. So for him, he looks at that mural and all he sees are some bankers controlling the world, and he thinks, well, that's good that he's put that up there.
Well, he questioned the removal of it, didn't he?
Yes, he questioned the removal of it.
Yeah.
The point is, at that point, his Facebook post, and he says, I didn't see it. And that's the point, is anti-Semitism is kind of invisible to people like Jeremy Corbyn to some extent because they are more interested in this idea of fighting the good fight against capitalism. And so when people decide to yoke together Jews and sort of grotesque capitalist figures, sometimes they can't see that because all they're interested in is categorising the capitalists in a bad way.
Right. Is that an excuse? Are you an apologist?
No, I don't think it's an excuse. I think it's just the discourse that they swim in. They swim in this discourse, and obviously it's been made worse by Israel because for a long time, for years, there was this idea, and I'm talking about the 18th, 19th centuries before that Jews were in control somehow of power and money or whatever. In fact, historically, because Jews weren't allowed to own property, so a lot of the time had to go into money lending and banking and whatever. So even that was the result of racism towards Jews. But then it was added to, in fairly recent years, by the idea that obviously Israel is a sort of imperial power and another example of something that these people who fight oppression have to fight against. And the association of Jews with that, again, takes them out of the Venn diagram of people we need to fight for, rather than they become people we need to punch up towards.
Now, Jeremy Corbyn has done a mea culpa. He has been unequivocal in his apology, some say for the very first time.
Yeah.
Is that going to be enough?
I don't know. I mean, obviously, a lot of people have said this thing about, it's a good thing to say. We'll have to see how the actions are. I mean, immediately, as soon as he does it, there are lots of people online and Labour MPs, indeed, saying, oh, this is just a trumped-up bit of, Blairite plotting or whatever to smear, or this thing about smearing Jeremy Corbyn, whatever. Even Jeremy Corbyn has said, it's not a smear, there are problems, we have to deal with it. And yet there is going to still be people saying, because of St Jeremy, that obviously it's a smear. So I think those are the people in a way. I think Corbyn he's done pretty well with this statement, but I think the people who just think Jeremy is a saint need to think, OK, listen to Jeremy, there is a problem here, and we need to deal with it.
How do you feel now as, a Jewish man who has voted Labour in the past? Will you continue to do so?
There is racism against Jews. It's very prevalent in some quarters. We, I guess, look, if anywhere, to the left to protect people from anti-racism. And so if that can come round again to being the right thing, the thing that should happen, then, yeah, I'll carry on voting Labour.
And do you think they can win back the rest of the Jewish community, which support for Labour's collapsed?
I've no idea. I mean, some of them definitely won't. Some of them probably would never have voted Labour. Some of them are very, very pro-Israel and would find the stance against Israel always a bad thing. I think I'm interested in, not voting for anything that would increase the That is not what happened, and Ken continually saying, I was just stating a historical fact, is just showing an incredible tin ear for the actuality of anti-Semitism that is created in that comment.
Thank you. David Baddiel talking to me a little earlier. Well, joining me here in the studio is the Shadow Transport Secretary, Andy McDonald. Welcome to the Daily Politics. Is anti-Semitism invisible to Jeremy Corbyn because of the way he sees the world?
No, I think he's recognised that there is a real issue and we've got to drive anti-Semitism out wherever it appears. And I've just come back from the Shadow Cabinet and there is a real commitment and a determination to eradicate anti-Semitism from wherever it appears.
Right. Why has it taken so long for him to notice?
I think he's noticed all of his life. I mean, you heard him speak at the Cable Street event not that long ago and spoke with great emotion and passion about standing shoulder to shoulder with people who oppose fascism.
But what about anti-Semitism? Why has it taken so long for him to apologise unequivocally for what he calls pockets of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party?
Well, there is that recognition, and there's also been.
But why has it taken so long?
Heartfelt. I'm not so sure that he's ever said anything other than being vehemently.
No, he's never issued a statement in the way he did yesterday and the day before.
Well, I'm sure, Joe. I'm absolutely convinced that Jeremy will have said these things over the years. It's part of his DNA to be so vehemently opposed to such offensive views.
Well, if that's the case, why have those pockets of anti-Semitism existed, much of it in Jeremy Corbyn's name?
Well, the identification is there. We're acknowledging and profusely apologising that obtains. But equal to that is the determination to properly get on top of this and weed it out wherever it appears. So the right response is there. And as I say, the commitment that I've just come away from that shadow cabinet meeting was absolutely tangible.
Right.
Everybody around the corner, with some very emotional accounts from people's own experiences. So we're entirely united in our determination to resolve this issue.
Right, you're entirely united, but unfortunately the statement that's just come out from the Jewish Leadership Council and the Board of Deputies of British Jews says, we note Jeremy Corbyn's apology, but we are almost 3 years into his leadership and words are no longer enough. Now we need action. What's that action going to be?
I think that's right. Words are not enough.
So what's the action?
And the action is to fully implement all of the Chakrabarti report.
Why haven't they been implemented?
Well, some of it has. Quite a good proportion of the Chakrabarti recommendations have been implemented by rule changes that's outlawing offensive language. Though anybody who would deny the Holocaust or try to seek some mitigation of it, those are prescribed activities that will lead to disciplinary charges.
And that happened at the conference, didn't it, last year? Right, but when was the Chakrabarti report done?
Well, it is. It's Joe, you're knocking at an open door because it's far too long. It's been too long in being fully implemented. Well, I think that's a collective failure within the Labour Party. And we've got a new General Secretary who's taking up her appointment, and this will be absolutely number one on her agenda to drive through all of the reforms that the Chakrabarti report set out. So please be reassured that that is taken with complete seriousness.
What other action are you going to take? Will you kick out Ken Livingstone from the party? I mean, he's been suspended for about 20 months. Why has a decision not been made?
Well, I'm not going to comment on individual cases, but the generic point is the correct one, and you make it well. This is ridiculous. It's taken far too long, 20 months. So now how we can resolve some of these issues is fulfil the recommendation of the Chakrabarti report, appoint the legal counsel within the organisation to have those panels of lawyers, because the reality is that people within the party come in to serve the party, to bring about those changes, and it gets highly technical. We've got to be infinitely better at speeding up these processes. It's quite ridiculous that it should take so long.
I mean, Andy MacDonald says he's not exactly sure why it's taken so long. It's ridiculous it's taken so long, and it will be dealt with now. What does that say to you about the leadership of the party?
Well, it's interesting you use the word leadership, because I think that's really the lesson to draw out of this. I've got no reason to believe that Jeremy Corbyn is anything other than absolutely resolute in his determination to root out any form of racism today. But I think what you've got to understand, if you've led a business or indeed you're leading a political party, is what he's done on your watch in your name is absolutely critical. It's about setting a tone, it's about the values that your leadership position allows. And I do think the Labour Party, to end up with 15 Labour MPs demonstrating yesterday, something has to have gone wrong in the leadership to get to that position.
Well, you know, that is being addressed. You can deal with the situation in front of you, and there is an absolute determination to implement all of those recommendations. Nothing could be further from more towards the top of Jeremy's agenda than this. This is the number one issue for us all, and we will address it. We will drive it out.
Right, just finally on that leadership question, what should be done, and should something be done then about the supporters that David Baddiel talked about, supporters of Corbyn who say it's a smear against him and actually there's more anti-Semitism on the right than on the left? Would leadership show if he stood up and denounced those people?
We are saying consistently this is not about a smear. put that to one side. If you go down that path, you start to deny the very issue in front of you. To get involved in such a ridiculous conversation is to denigrate and devalue this critically important issue, and it is not about smears. The issue is anti-Semitism and how you get rid of it, and that's what we're focusing on.
Andy McDonald, thank you for coming in. Now, you know what it's like. You ask two old friends for some advice on a really thorny issue, and they both tell you to do the exact opposite. Well, that's kind of what's happened to Theresa May today. Two Conservative big beasts, Chris Patten and Jacob Rees-Mogg, have been giving the Prime Minister very different advice on Brexit. We'll speak to them both in a moment, but first, let's take a look at those speeches, starting with Lord Patten's attack on the prospect of the UK signing trade deals after Brexit.
One problem is that the ministers who talk about these fictitious trade deals have never actually negotiated one. The closest they've come to a trade deal is the checkout at Waitrose. There's a simple answer to the Northern Ireland border question and to much else besides, and it's provided by, as ever, by Sherlock Holmes. When you have eliminated, he said, what is impossible, you're probably left with the solution. And the solution is the one that Anna Soubry mentioned earlier. Let's stay in the customs union.
Some of the great panjandrums of our time have told us that we are all very stupid and that we did not know what we were doing, that we did not realise that we were voting to leave the customs union and the single market, and that it was all done by uneducated people who ought to have listened to their betters. In truth, the vote was by people who believed in democracy. They recognised that the system that they were used to, where sending a Member of Parliament to Westminster who would determine their laws and seek redress of grievance, was under threat because once it was EU law, it was impossible. They voted to take back control.
Well, that was Jacob Rees-Mogg, but Lord Patten joins me here in the studio. Welcome to the Daily Politics.
Nice to be here, Jay.
You said today, at the beginning, in fact, of that clip that we showed, that the closest that government ministers have come to a free trade deal is the checkout at Waitrose. What were you getting at exactly with that supermarket analogy?
Well, what I was suggesting is that there have been all sorts of reasons adduced for not staying in the customs union, the biggest of which is that we can't then do trade deals on our own. What are these trade deals that we're going to do on our own? The first ones would have to be trying to, as they say, grandfather, trying to do a cut and paste job on the existing trade deals which the European Union has done. And that isn't a straightforward business. If you look at the trade deal, one of the best that's been done with South Korea, and we're not going to get, because of rules of origin, the same sort of deal as Europe got for our car industry. If you look at services, there are all sorts of trade deals that we've done, that Europe's done, which include services, Vietnam, Cambodia and others. You won't get those if we're doing it on our own. Liam Fox, I'm sure he was a good GP, but Liam Fox doesn't really know anything about trade, and he has argued that in a year's time, within a minute, I think he said, of leaving the European Union, we'd have 40 trade deals to sign off. It's nonsense.
Well, there are countries that have said they are willing, of course, to sign trade deals. We've heard it from the likes of Australia, for example, and New Zealand.
What proportion of our exports go to Australia?
Yes, a much smaller proportion than our exports, obviously, to the EU.
To Ireland.
But what's to say it's a zero-sum game? I mean, David Davis was speaking at the weekend, the Brexit Secretary, and he said getting a really good trade deal with the EU is now overwhelmingly likely. At the very least, you would accept that we would get a Canada-style deal with goods, and they are hoping for something much better. Do you agree with that?
Do you want to know about the Canada deal?
No.
I'm sure you don't. I mean, these are rather boring subjects to talk about, but they're extremely important. Canada, most of Canada's exports to the European Union are commodities which are free of tariffs, things like gold and oil. We do 11 times as much service exports to European Union.
But why wouldn't we get a good deal with the EU?
Because it wouldn't be as good as we've got now.
It might not be as good, and Theresa May has said that, but it would still be good.
Well, if what you're saying is Theresa May says, well, we'll be outside the European Union, but it won't be as good for us when we are, I think that's true.
But it could be made up with those free trade deals that will be signed afterwards, and the combination of the two will be worthwhile.
Look, we do more trade with Ireland than we do with Korea, Japan, India and Australia combined. We're not going to make up in new trade deals what we lose from departing from the European Union. And don't forget that for years it was Britain that was opposing bilateral trade deals with countries like China and others on the grounds, I thought it was right at the time, that bilateral trade deals are merely ways of diverting trade, and that what we had to find were multilateral deals which actually reduced tariffs and increased access across the board.
If you were
That's the
advising,
boring fact about
but important. At the moment, is it still impossible to find a solution that will overcome that issue of having an invisible border, retaining that, having a customs partnership, which the Prime Minister talked about, where Britain mirrors EU tariffs, and then technical solutions on top where people could pre-register when they're travelling across?
Name one country that does that.
You laugh.
Name a country that does that.
Well, there are countries. I mean, Norway and Sweden would have some pre-registering.
Shall I talk to you about that?
They do have infrastructure, I agree.
They have border posts and they have customs officers. And something else they have is that customs officials for both sides are able to travel into the other country to a 15-kilometre line,
sure.
I think.
But what about if the political will is there?
You can imagine people being really keen, if they're from Northern Ireland or the Republic, of driving to make sure to invigilate customs rules into the other territory.
But isn't this
inconceivable.
But isn't it about political will, Chris Patten? If everybody agrees they don't want a hard border, they don't want that infrastructure, and there are technical ways of getting round some of the issues.
There aren't. Tell me what they are.
Well, it's not for me, of course, to represent the government. But there are technical solutions that exist at certain ports where you can pre-register. You can have regular suppliers pre-registering. It would be something that could be arranged for smaller businesses. Is it possible?
No, I don't think it is. And I tell you who doesn't. I know nobody who knows about these things who thinks it is. The former Secretary-General of the WTO, Pascal Lamy, was also European Trade Commissioner. Now, he's suspect because he's French and he knows what he's talking about, so you can't believe him. He says there is no example anywhere in the world of a virtual border when there are different customs regimes. How do you deal with the issue of different duties? How do you make negotiations with other countries on free trade agreement if you don't have a border yourself?
Right. Your speech was introduced by the Conservative MP Anna Soubry. Do you agree with what she said last month, that Theresa May is in hock to 35 hard ideological Brexiteers and that she should stand up to them and possibly sling them out the party?
Well, I don't necessarily find that I have to agree with everybody I agree with on the big issues.
Sure.
But
what about those things?
She can speak for herself. I think it's certainly true that the real management issue for Mrs May so far has been managing the right wing of the Conservative, have been managing people like Jacob, who I've known for years, since he was 8. The trouble is, his views when he was 8, when he was charming, eccentric kid, are much the same as they are when he was 48. And I think that here's an intelligent guy who's been taken over by the personality which the press have assigned to him. So I do think that managing people like Jacob, nice fellow that he is, has actually taken precedence with the leadership of the Conservative Party over doing the best deal for Britain.
Right. What do you say, listening to Chris Patten, particularly about the trade deals and about the border with Ireland?
Absolutely. So the first thing I'd say is the purpose of having a mayor for the West Midlands is to fight for our interests in this whole debate. And Chris mentioned the car industry, so let's be really clear. The single biggest priority for West Midlands business, given the nature of our economy, the export success of the UK, the only area with a trade surplus with China, the only area to have grown its exports rapidly over the last 5 years, is that we negotiate the trade deal with the EU over the next 7-8 months. I expect that to happen, and indeed I'll be down to see David Davis this afternoon to talk about exactly that and why it's so important all cars manufactured in the West Midlands move through different EU countries in the supply chain. So we have to have that. That's the #1 priority.
Just before I let you go, will it be Stop Brexit?
I don't know. What I think is imperative is that Parliament should have the last word. And if you believe in taking back control, then you should think that it's decided in Parliament. And I'm sure that you'll get from Jacob an absolute commitment that there should be a free vote in the House of Commons.
Well, let's see, because we're about to talk to him. Chris Patten, thank you. Thank you very much for coming in. Yes, we can now speak to Jacob Rees-Mogg, as promised, who's in central London and has just finished giving his speech. Welcome to the programme, Jacob Rees-Mogg. What were you getting at with your analogy about Japanese soldiers in World War II?
Well, you just needed to listen to Lord Patten, who is an immensely distinguished figure. And what he was saying was basically that the result of the referendum should be overturned and that we should remain in the single market and the customs union. That isn't what people voted for. It isn't what was put in the manifestos for the election last year. And I'm glad to say it isn't government policy. So I think that they are expecting something to be happening that is not happening.
Right. I mean, you've also said reneging on Brexit would be like Suez, a national humiliation based on lies. Do you really mean that?
Oh, I very much mean that. I think the nation has spoken. It has decided that it wants to have its own independent future. And this has been a great democratic event for us, and a very exciting one, that we have shown that we are willing to go our own way. If this were undermined by subterfuge, by people saying they don't really want to reverse it when in fact they do, then that would indeed be a national humiliation. The United Kingdom is not Denmark or Ireland, who, when they voted against the European Union, were told to vote again until they gave the right answer. Just to be treated in that way would be denying the greatness and the standing of our country.
Right. I mean, Chris Patten, you may have heard, said your views as an 8-year-old were eccentric, and they still are, and they haven't changed as a 48-year-old. What do you say to that?
Well, I don't remember discussing the European Union with Lord Patten when I was 8, though I have indeed known him a long time. What I would say to his lordship is that when he was governor of Hong Kong, I greatly supported him in trying to bring democracy to Hong Kong. It is a great sadness that he doesn't want democracy in the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, he thinks he and his fellow Panjandrams know best, and that we should have done what we were told in the referendum.
Right.
I agree with him that democracy is a good thing. He thought it was right in Hong Kong, and I think it's right in the United Kingdom.
Right. But, I mean, he says the reason that he is fighting the idea of coming out of the single market and the customs union is because all the talk of new trade deals has been vastly exaggerated. You will never be able to make up that amount of trade from the loss of the deal with the EU, which we now know we are going to lose some access because Theresa May has said it. He says the closest the government has come to a free trade deal is the checkout at Waitrose. Is that true?
No, it's not true at all. And I must confess, I thought his tone was rather condescending when he said that he knew so much more than the current Secretary of State for International Trade. Liam Fox has been concentrating on this, travelling the world discussing this with our friends and allies since he was appointed, and discovers that there is a great openness to trade deals, and these can be done very quickly. The deal between Australia and the United States was done in under a year and led to a very significant increase in trade between Australia and the United States.
Right.
So not only can these deals be done quickly if there's a will, but they also lead to considerable expansions in trade. So there's great opportunity there.
Right, but I mean, even according to the famous leaked civil service analysis, which is now in the public domain, Brexit will hit growth by up to 8% over the next 15 years, and a free trade deal with America would only add 0.2% to growth over the same period, which backs up what Chris Patten has been saying. So the sums don't add up. And what makes you think you know more about economics than both the civil service and the IFS?
Oh, well, I'm very happy to say that most people know more than the Treasury, which got it so catastrophically wrong before the referendum. The Treasury said there would be up to 800,000 job losses purely on a vote to leave. This was nonsense. This was Project Fear. And the Treasury, having been humiliated by the errors of its pre-Brexit vote forecasts, has then made even worse forecasts subsequently. And in that paper, it did not even consider, it did not evaluate, it made no estimates for the government's preferred option by way of the deal that we would have. So it was a worthless paper. And there are many better economists and professional economists, not like me, I accept that I am not a professional economist, who believe that we will have very significant advantages if we embrace free trade.
What do you say to Chris Patten's assertion, which is actually factually correct in the sense that there is no technological solution to the border issue in Ireland that currently exists?
Well, there's a border in Ireland already, that there are different rates of VAT, there are different rates of
Sure, but when we come out of the EU, where else in the world, Jacob Rees-Mogg, is there a technological solution?
Like Magnus Magnusson, I've started so I'll finish. There is already a border, but it is a soft border, and it is perfectly possible to have a border that is implemented remotely. When people talk about a hard border, what they mean are people in peaked caps and barriers going up and down. You do not need those. You can have tariffs, if there are any, paid in the same way as VAT. You can have inspections for health reasons of food going back and forth at the site of production on behalf of the country that they are going to. All of this is perfectly feasible. So the question is, do you need people in peaked caps and infrastructure at the border, to which the answer is no. Will there be a change? Yes, of course there will, and everybody accepts that.
Right. Where else does that exist in the world?
Where else does what exist in the world?
Having a technological solution so that you can have an invisible border without the men and women in peak caps.
Well, just because something isn't there currently doesn't mean it's impossible to do. And in fact, it's really easy. But if you've got historic border structures, you have to remember that the tendency is to leave them there. So it's a new structure, but it's a very easily deliverable one. And if you want an example where there's no border at all, there's one between the EU and the Vatican. But as the Vatican is not huge, I don't think that necessarily counts.
Not huge, that is an understatement there. I mean, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Chris Patten
echoed... It's very important
well,
in many
but we were
ways,
talking about size
huge.
there. Chris Patten echoed John Major in saying there should be a free vote in Parliament. Would you support that?
Did Lord Patten support free votes when he was chairman of the Conservative Party? Conservatives stood on a manifesto saying that they would implement the referendum and that we would leave the single market and the customs union. If you have said to your voters that that is what you will do, in honour you owe it to them to deliver on that. If any MP at the last election said that they disagreed with that and put out a private election address, then that's a different matter. But the overall Conservative manifesto was absolutely clear, and those of us who were elected as Conservatives must stick to what we have promised to the electorate. To behave otherwise would be improper.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much. Listening to both of those, there is a fundamental division at the heart of the Conservative Party over how to deal with Brexit. Who do you think will win that battle in the end? Will it be Jacob Rees-Mogg and the people who agree with him, or will it be Chris Patten?
You might think this is a sort of cop-out answer, and you might think it's not, politicians have never done that. But actually, I think the Prime Minister will win this argument, and let me explain what I mean by that. She delivered the first Brexit deal, the divorce. I have already said I think that she and the negotiating team will deliver the second element, and the first priority there is, of course, the free trade deal with the EU to try to maintain the advantages that we currently have. And actually, we've already talked about the fact that will then have to be an independent immigration policy as well, and I think that could almost be described as the third chapter. And I do believe that we are working through that chapter by chapter. Now, you might say that's optimistic, but I think the evidence so far would lead you to believe that that's so. And you asked me earlier question what I thought people in the West Midlands thought and said. My feeling about what's said to me on the ground is they do agree with what Jacob just said, in that the Conservative Party stood on a manifesto to make a success of leaving, and they want to see that happening. But they also understand in business that we do need those deals to maintain the advantage we already have of free trade within the EU.
All right, I think that was a bridge between the two sides.
But maybe that's the practical answer that's going to come through, and that's where I am.
It's not been a great start to the year for the British High Street. Just yesterday, the fashion chain Select announced up to 2,000 job cuts. Earlier this month, Toys R Us collapsed into administration along with the electronics retailer Maplin. Experts say retailers are battling a perfect storm of pressures, and our reporter Greg Dawson has been on the High Street in Chelmsford.
As high streets go, Chelmsford's is faring much better than most. Just 1 in 10 shops are vacant here. Scratch the surface though, and there are signs of a wider struggle. Moss Bros says sales are lower than expected. Mothercare is struggling to pay its debts. BHS is long gone. Maplin going. And even the traditional strong performers aren't doing as well as they'd like. For the 5th year in a row, John Lewis has had to cut staff bonuses because of a fall in profits. So what exactly is going wrong on the British High Street? And what can be done to help?
With my online delivery, I've got Premier Delivery, so I can get it next day. So literally, if I'm sitting at home watching TV, I can just do one click. For big items, maybe if I'm going to spend a lot of money on them, then I need to go into the shop because I like to see what they are. But to be honest with you, I love shopping, online shopping, when it's just cheap clothes and tops because they come the next day. If I don't like it, I'll send it back.
But the growth of online shopping means less money spent in the physical stores, meaning they have less money for rent and business rates.
We all need to take part and believe in the future of our town centres. You can see from the shops here, they're of varying sizes, they have varying cost bases. Department stores obviously have much larger cost bases than smaller shops, but pro rata, they still face the same challenges. They have the minimum wage, they have their business rates, they have the repairs of the buildings, everything adds up.
David says there's little the government can do to stop people shopping online, but says there are other ways to help.
They can do something about it with business rates, but whether there is any political will or any fiscal will remains to be seen.
And when the major players on the high street say they're feeling the burn of business rates, you can bet so are the smaller firms. Heather was hoping for a business rate cut this year. Bit of a surprise then when they were increased.
My bill last year was £668 last year, and a month I should say, and this year's it's going to be £744 a month. I feel more pressurised to have more stock. There's nothing you want worse than a customer coming in and saying, oh, we haven't got it, oh, well, I might as well get it online.
The government says rates will be assessed more frequently from 2021. But amidst all the anxiety, there are some feeling positively chirpy. Last year, Bill qualified for a rate relief introduced to try and help thousands of small firms.
Well, as you can see, I was paying £6,120 when I took the shop over. I'm now paying £1,530. That's a big saving for me.
One happy shop owner, but if there are to be more, campaigners say politicians have to find ways to level the playing field with the online competition before even more of our shops disappear.
A little reminder of John Lewis there in
took me back in time.
Did it take you back? What's your answer to levelling the playing field for retailers on the high street?
Yeah, so first thing to say is obviously there's a mega trend going on here, the trend towards online, and we have to be realistic that you can't stop that trend actually. However, and we should also say Britain's very good at online retail and lots of new jobs are being created by that as well. So it isn't just one-way traffic. In terms of what's already been done to level the playing field, we should just call that out. When I was MD of John Lewis, I perhaps infamously was talking about tax for online retailers. There has been now the move to make sure that online retailers are domiciled in the UK and they pay fair tax, so that's been important. And of course, there's already been the increase in the threshold for paying business rates for small businesses, and about 600,000 small businesses will not pay business rates at all. So some things have already been done.
Right. Now, you mentioned the issue of tax and taxing fairly. What about taxing revenues? Online, not just on profits, but on their revenues, and they might even consider doing that unilaterally. You wouldn't support that?
Well, what I do support is looking at other methods. They're examining that at the moment. There isn't a commitment. There's my view is there probably has to be a basket of different things, actually, because that's how businesses make money. We already tax on employment, don't we? We tax on property, we tax on profit. It's the question of the balance between them.
All right, let's leave it there. Now, whatever happened to the Young Conservatives? Founded at the Junior Imperial League in 1906, in the 1950s it had 150,000 members, making it the largest political youth organisation outside the Soviet bloc. In the 1980s, however, the image of the Young Tories moved from from the country's most successful marriage bureau to brash factionalism. By the 1990s, the comedian Harry Enfield had created his Tory boy character, capturing the popular perception of the Conservatives' youth wing.
Do you want your house to be compulsorily purchased and turned into an Indian women's hopscotch collective? That's what Gordon Brown wants. And conference. Do you want to look out of your bedroom window one morning to find that your car has been taken away by a stranger? It's not been stolen, oh no. It's been given away by Brussels to a Spanish fisherman. That's what Tony Blair wants.
Takes us back a bit. Harry Enfield with his Tory boy character. Well, with me is a real-life Conservative student activist and definitely not a Tory boy, Lucy Woodruff, and also the newly elected Labour NEC youth rep, Lara McNeil. Welcome to both of you. Lucy, you look at that and what do you think?
It's quite astonishing, isn't it? I mean, Young Conservatives has changed a lot in a short space of time with the new Young Conservative being launched just the other week. There's some great things going on in the Conservative Party. We're really getting behind the government and there are exciting times to come.
Right. I mean, is it still uncool to be a young Conservative?
Not at all. I mean, I run the Durham University Conservative Association along with my colleagues. And, I mean, on campus we have a large presence, we have great social events as well as guest speakers coming up. And there really is a fun aspect to the Conservative Party. And, of course, I'm here. I'm cool, so...
You are. Being on the Daily Politics really is the last word in cool. Andy will tell you all about that. Lara, what made you decide to join? In fact, now you are the newly elected youth rep on Labour's NEC.
Yeah, I don't think it's about being cool or fun or anything. I think it's about looking at society and realising that young people deserve better than what they're getting under the Tories. I joined because education and the NHS were really important to me. I'm a medical student, and when I was applying to university, I realised that my income affected my chances in life. And the Tories claim to be the party of aspiration, but I definitely didn't feel that. And Labour spoke to me with their policies.
And are most of your friends left-leaning?
Yeah, a lot of them are. I think even the ones that aren't members of the Labour Party, they see that Labour speaks for them, whether that's about cutting tuition fees, addressing the mental health crisis, the housing crisis. It's issues that they care about, and Labour's speaking for them. Right.
Would it be brave, in your opinion, to join the Young Conservatives, for a friend of yours to come out and say, I'm a Young Conservative?
Yeah, but I don't think it's about individuals being brave. I think that whatever's someone's political view, you should, you know, debate it and talk about it. But I don't think it's about individuals being brave. It's about standing up for what's right for young people.
Well, if that's the case, why on the Durham Conservative Students' website it says the decision to join really went down well in her hometown of Liverpool?
That's true. Well, quite sarcastic. I mean, Liverpool's overwhelmingly Labour. But I joined the party because I believe we're the party of opportunity, social mobility. I'm from a working class background, and through the Conservatives I've been able to go to university, benefit from the maintenance loan, and, you know, it's all down to my own hard work and achievement, and the Conservatives have supported me through that.
Right, and how many sort of young people are there? I mean, do you feel there are more now than there have been in the last sort of 5-10 years?
Definitely so. I mean, every couple of weeks we get more and more new members wanting to join what we're doing because they see that, you know, we're a stable... The Conservatives provide stable economy where we understand that if we spend more, if the Labour government spends more, we have to pay off the debt when we grow up. So it's about providing a stable economy.
Lara, the idea that the Labour Party is suddenly overrun with young people, certainly Momentum has obviously grown the membership. That's a myth, isn't it? Because actually the average age is actually 53.
Well, we're a fifth of the party, so there's 110,000 young members to about 500,000, and Young Labour itself overtakes the Conservative and Lib Dem parties. They estimate the Conservatives have about 70,000 members, so we're definitely a mass movement, and the average age of the Conservative Party is estimated to be 72, so I don't think we're really doing that badly in comparison, are we?
Right. Do you know what the average age of Conservative members is? Is it as high as 72?
It probably is, but it doesn't mean that there aren't any young people there. And the Conservative Party speaks for us because young people grow up to be older people. So.
We were young once, weren't we? I mean, you are younger anyway, I'm sure. Were you a member of Young Conservatives?
No, I was a Conservative student, though, and I mean, that image takes us back to an image perhaps we want to forget. But, I mean, Lucy's right. If you were to walk the streets of the West Midlands with the team for the local council elections, you'd see lots of young people. And the really important thing is they're representative of modern Britain, from diverse communities, working in very ambitious jobs. And I'm very confident that our message is connecting.
All right.
It's about jobs, housing, things that matter.
And on that, we have to say goodbye. Thanks for bringing the average age down of the programme. Bye-bye.
So where did the money come from?
It's real money, and it's more than 100